In the dusty town of Bitter Creek, where justice was decided by mob rule and mercy was a luxury few could afford, a scarred drifter named Jake Sullivan witnessed something that would change everything. When the townspeople dragged an innocent young woman from her home, accusing her of witchcraft after a string of mysterious deaths, Jake made a choice that branded him an outcast. Little did he know that his single act of defiance would awaken forces beyond his wildest imagination, and that sometimes protecting one soul can save an entire valley. Witness how one man's courage in the face of hatred transformed a community forever. Subscribe and ring the bell to discover the incredible true power of standing up for what's right, even when you stand alone. The sun beat down mercilessly on Bitter Creek as Jake Sullivan rode into town, his weathered face hidden beneath the brim of a hat that had seen too many storms. The leather reins felt familiar in his calloused hands, the only constant in a life spent moving from one forgotten place to another. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Duchess, snorted softly as they approached the main street, sensing the tension that seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jake had learned long ago to read towns the way other men read newspapers. Bitter Creek spoke of desperation in the boarded-up windows of abandoned shops, in the suspicious glances of residents who watched him from doorways, in the way conversations died as he passed. This was a community eating itself alive, and he'd seen enough of those to know he wouldn't be staying long. The saloon doors swung open with a creak that seemed to echo his arrival. Inside, the usual collection of ranchers, drifters, and locals nursed their drinks in uncomfortable silence. Jake ordered whiskey and found a corner table, his back to the wall out of habit. He'd learned in Kansas that keeping your spine protected was the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. "You picked a hell of a time to ride in, stranger," said the bartender, a grizzled man with arms like tree trunks. "Town's got itself worked up over some nonsense about curses and such." Jake lifted his glass but didn't drink. "Curses? 3 men dead in as many weeks," whispered an old-timer at the bar, his voice shaky with fear or whiskey, maybe both. "Doc says it was fever, but folks know better. Started right after that Mendez girl came to town." The mention of the name sent a ripple through the room. Jake noticed how men crossed themselves or touched Lucky Charms, their faces darkening with something uglier than fear. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of men who'd rather burn down the world than admit their own failures. "Elena Mendez," continued the old man, louder now, emboldened by the audience. "Mexican girl, claims to be fleeing bandits down south. But I've seen how she looks at folks, how she whispers in that foreign tongue. Mark my words, she's brought the devil's work to our town." Jake had heard enough. He finished his drink in one burning swallow and stood, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the room in its grip, and conversations resumed in hushed tones. As he pushed through the saloon doors, he caught fragments of angry voices planning something that made his stomach turn. Outside, the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Jake loosened his collar and surveyed the street, noting the clusters of men gathering in the shade, their voices low and urgent. He recognized the signs, a community preparing to do something terrible in the name of righteousness. He found Elena Mendez exactly where he expected to, in the small church at the end of town, kneeling before a simple wooden cross. She couldn't have been more than 20, with long dark hair that caught the light streaming through stained glass windows. Her hands were folded in prayer, and even from the doorway Jake could see they trembled. "Miss," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and he saw eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. There were bruises on her cheek, fresh ones that spoke of recent violence. "You should not be here, senor," she whispered in accented English. "It's dangerous for you to be seen with me." Jake removed his hat, a gesture his mother had taught him decades ago in a life that seemed like someone else's memory. "Name's Jake Sullivan, miss. I heard talk in town. Thought you should know. They're working themselves up to something." Eleanor rose gracefully, smoothing down her simple brown dress. Despite the fear in her eyes, she carried herself with a dignity that reminded Jake of nobility he'd glimpsed in grand houses back east. "I know what they think," she said. "They think I bring the death, the sickness, but I only come here to escape the violence in my home. I never hurt anyone." "I believe you," Jake said, and meant it. He'd developed an instinct for truth over the years, honed by too many encounters with liars and predators. This young woman radiated innocence, the way a candle radiates light. The sound of approaching voices made them both freeze. Through the church windows, Jake could see torches being lit despite the daylight, men gathering with ropes and the kind of grim determination that preceded atrocities. "They're coming," Eleanor breathed, her hand going instinctively to a small silver cross at her throat. Jake made his decision in that moment, though he couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was the way she stood there, facing certain death with quiet dignity. Maybe it was the memory of another innocent person he'd failed to protect years ago in a mining camp in Colorado. Or maybe it was simply that he'd spent too many years running from fights that mattered. "Not if I can help it," he said, his hand moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. The weight of it felt heavier than usual, loaded not just with bullets, but with the knowledge that using it would make him an enemy of every man in Bitter Creek. The church door burst open, and Jake stepped protectively in front of Elena as a mob of 20 men poured in, led by a big man with a sheriff's badge that caught the light like a target. The sheriff's face was flushed with alcohol and righteous anger, his meaty hands gripping a coil of rope. "Step aside, stranger," Sheriff Hawkins growled. "This ain't your concern." Jake didn't move. "Making it my concern." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes violence, thick with possibility and consequence. Jake felt Elena's presence behind him, her breathing quick and shallow. He thought of Duchess waiting outside, of the long road stretching toward the next town, of the peace he'd found in solitude. All of it seemed very far away now. "You don't know what she's done," Hawkins said, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. 3 good men are dead because of her witchcraft." "I know what fear looks like," Jake replied steadily. "And I know what courage looks like. Right now I'm seeing plenty of the first and none of the second." The mob shifted restlessly, hands moving to weapons, but something in Jake's stance, the casual way his hand rested near his gun, the complete lack of fear in his weathered face, gave them pause. He'd learned in a dozen frontier towns that sometimes the appearance of readiness was more powerful than readiness itself. "Last chance, Drifter," Hawkins spat. "Walk away or we'll hang you alongside the witch." Jake smiled then, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Sheriff, I've been threatened by Apaches, Mexican bandits, claim jumpers, and cattle barons. You and your boys don't scare me much." The standoff stretched taut as a wire, 20 armed men facing one, with an innocent young woman caught in the balance. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain that might wash the dust from Bitter Creek streets, but nothing that could wash away what was about to happen. In that moment, Jake Sullivan knew his life as a wandering loner was over. Whatever came next, he'd chosen his side. The silence in the church stretched like a held breath. Jake could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on him, calculating odds, measuring his resolve. Behind him, Elena Mendez whispered what sounded like a prayer in Spanish, her voice barely audible above the thunder that was growing closer. Sheriff Hawkins took a step forward, his hand resting on his gun butt. "You're making a mistake, stranger. This girl's cursed. Ever since she came to town, good men have been dying. Doc Morrison found them with their faces twisted in agony, their bodies covered in marks no disease ever made." Jake had seen enough frontier justice to know that fear could transform ordinary people into monsters. Coincidence isn't evidence, Sheriff, and even if it wasn't, last I checked, we still had trials in this country. "Trials are for civilized folk," spat Tom Bradley, the bank owner whose son had been the first to die. His face was twisted with grief and rage. "My boy was healthy as a horse before she showed up. Now he's in the ground, and she's still walking around free as you please." Elena stepped forward, her chin raised despite her obvious terror. "Senor Bradley, your son was kind to me. He helped me find work at the laundry. I would never—" "Shut your mouth, witch!" Bradley lunged forward, but Jake's gun appeared in his hand with the fluid motion of long practice. The click of the hammer being pulled back echoed through the church like a judgment. "That's far enough," Jake said quietly. The Colt .45 might as well have been an extension of his arm, steady as stone despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Next man who moves toward her answers to me." The mob hesitated, suddenly aware that the situation had escalated beyond angry words and threats. Jake Sullivan might be outnumbered, but something in his stance, in the practiced ease with which he held his weapon, suggested that several of them wouldn't live to see sunset if they pressed forward. You can't protect her forever, Sullivan, Hawkins said, his voice attempting authority he clearly didn't feel. Sooner or later you'll have to sleep, have to eat, have to tend your horse. When you do, we'll be waiting. Maybe, Jake acknowledged, but I'm thinking you boys might want to reconsider. See, I spent some time down in Mexico a few years back, learned some interesting things about customs, about justice, about the kind of trouble that follows a man who hurts innocent people. He was bluffing, hoping to buy time, but Elena's sharp intake of breath suggested his words had hit closer to truth than he'd intended. The young woman stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of the soap she used, the clean smell that somehow made her seem even more vulnerable. "Jake," she whispered urgently, "you don't understand. My family, they will come looking for me. If something happens—" "Nothing's going to happen," Jake said firmly, though he kept his gun trained on the crowd. "These men are going to walk out of here, go home to their families, and think real hard about what they were about to do in God's house." Thunder crashed overhead, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the church windows. The storm that had been building all day was finally breaking, and with it, the tension in the room seemed to shift. Several of the men exchanged glances, their enthusiasm for mob violence dampened by the weather and the sight of Jake's unwavering Colt. "This ain't over," Bradley said, backing toward the door. "She's cursed, I tell you. Mark my words, more people will die and it'll be on your head, Sullivan." "I'll risk it," Jake replied. One by one, the men filed out of the church, muttering threats and casting dark looks over their shoulders. Sheriff Hawkins was the last to leave, his face promising future trouble. When the church was finally empty, except for Jake and Eleanor, he slowly lowered his gun, but didn't holster it. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity. "Thank you," Elena said softly, "but Senor Bradley is right about one thing. This is not over. They will try again." Jake finally looked at her directly, studying her face in the dim light filtering through the stained glass. She was beautiful in a way that transcended mere physical appearance. There was something luminous about her, a quality that made him understand why frightened people might see her as otherworldly. "Tell me the truth," he said, "all of it. Who are you really?" Eleanor moved to one of the wooden pews and sat down heavily, as if the confrontation had drained all her strength. "My name is Elena Isabella Mendez de Castillo. My father was Don Carlos Mendez, one of the largest landowners in Sonora. Was, because he is dead now, killed by Yaqui raiders 3 months ago." Jake holstered his gun and sat across from her, sensing that the story was about to get more complicated. "Your nobility was," she corrected. "When my father died, everything changed. His brother, my uncle Ramon, claimed the estate. He said that a woman could not inherit, could not manage the land. But the truth—" She hesitated, then met his eyes directly. "The truth is that Ramon arranged my father's death. I heard him planning it with the Yaqui chief, promising them gold and cattle in exchange for making it look like a raid." The pieces were starting to fall into place for Jake. "So you ran." "I ran. But Ramon cannot let me live. I am the only witness to his crime, the only one who can challenge his claim to the estate. He has sent men to find me, to kill me. I thought I could hide here, in this small town so far from Mexico. I thought I was safe." Jake understood now why she radiated that sense of otherworldliness. She carried herself like nobility because she was nobility, raised in a world of wealth and privilege that most frontier folk could barely imagine. No wonder the townspeople found her strange alien. "The deaths," he said. "The men who died. What do you know about that?" Elena's face crumpled, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked her age. "Nothing. I swear on my father's grave, I know nothing. But—" She paused, pressing her hands together. "But I am afraid that Ramon's men may have found me. I am afraid they may be killing innocent people to force me into the open." Outside, lightning illuminated the church windows, followed immediately by thunder that shook the building. The storm was directly overhead now, and Jake found himself thinking that it was fitting. Storms had a way of washing the world clean, of changing everything in their wake. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said, standing. "My horse is fast, and I know country between here and the territorial capital. We can—" "No." Eleanor's voice was firm. "No more running. If Ramon's men are here, If they are killing innocent people because of me, then I cannot run anymore. I will not let others die for my sins." Jake stared at her, recognizing something in her expression that he'd seen in mirrors for years, the look of someone who had carried guilt and shame for too long. "It's not your fault that your uncle is a murderer." "Perhaps not. But it is my fault that I ran instead of staying to fight him. It is my fault that innocent people in a town I do not even know are dying because I am a coward." "Standing up to 20 armed men doesn't make you a coward," Jake said, but Eleanor was no longer listening. She had moved to the altar and was kneeling again, her lips moving in silent prayer. As Jake watched her, he felt something shift inside his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since his wife and daughter had died in that influenza outbreak in Colorado, he felt like he had something worth protecting, something worth fighting for beyond his own survival. The rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the windows and casting dancing shadows across the church floor. In those shadows, Jake thought he could see the future taking shape, dangerous, uncertain, but somehow brighter than the endless succession of empty towns and meaningless days that had defined his life for so long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, in this small church in the middle of nowhere, Jake Sullivan had found something he'd thought lost forever, a reason to hope. Dawn broke grey and sullen over Bitter Creek, the storm having passed but leaving the air thick with humidity and the scent of wet earth. Jake had spent the night in the church, dozing fitfully in a pew while Eleanor slept curled up near the altar, his gun never far from his hand. The restless sleep had been filled with dreams of Colorado, of another woman he'd failed to protect, and he'd awakened with the familiar weight of old guilt pressing down on his chest. Helena stirred as the first light filtered through the stained glass windows, transforming her dark hair into something that seemed to glow with its own inner fire. She moved gracefully despite having slept on hard wood, and Jake found himself wondering again how a woman raised in luxury had adapted so well to hardship. "Buenos dias," she said softly, her voice hoarse from sleep. "Did you rest at all?" "Enough," Jake lied, stretching muscles that protested after a night of uncomfortable vigilance. "We need to figure out our next move. That mob won't stay away forever, and if your uncle's men are in town—" His words were cut off by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jake was on his feet instantly, his Colt in his hand as he moved to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. A group of 6 men on horseback, their clothes dusty from hard travel, their faces bearing the hard stamp of professional killers. At their head rode a man with silver-streaked hair and cold eyes that Jake recognized from too many wanted posters. "Cristo Santo," Elena breathed, having joined him at the window. "Miguel Castellanos, Ramon's enforcer." Jake had heard of Castellanos, a former Rurales captain who'd gone bad, selling his skills to the highest bidder. The man was said to be fast with a gun and completely without conscience, the kind of killer who could sleep soundly after burning down an orphanage. "Stay back," Jake ordered, but Elena was already moving, her face set with sudden determination. "No," she said firmly, "this ends now. I will not let more innocent people die because of my cowardice." Before Jake could stop her, she was walking toward the church door. He caught her arm, spinning her around to face him. "You walk out there, you're dead. Is that what you want?" "What I want," Elena said, her dark eyes flashing, "is for the killing to stop. What I want is justice for my father. What I want is to stop running from who I am and what I must do." There was steel in her voice now, something that reminded Jake that she came from a line of people who had carved an empire out of hostile desert. For all her youth and beauty, Elena Mendez de Castillo was not as fragile as she appeared. The church door opened, and Sheriff Hawkins stepped inside, his face grim. Behind him came 3 of the men from yesterday's mob, their expressions a mixture of fear and anger. "Sullivan," Hawkins said, his hand resting on his gun. "These men want to see the girl. They're asking questions about the deaths, about her connection to what's been happening." Jake moved protectively in front of Elena, though she tried to step around him. "And you're just going to hand her over? Whatever happened to law and order, Sheriff?" Hawkins' face flushed. "Law and order is what I'm trying to preserve. These men have badges, Sullivan. They're federal marshals investigating the murders." The lie was obvious. Jake had seen enough real marshals to know that Castellanos and his men were about as federal as a rattlesnake, But before he could call Hawkins on it, Elena spoke up from behind him. "Let them come in," she said calmly. "I have nothing to hide." Jake wanted to shake her, to make her understand the danger she was courting, but something in her tone, something in the way she stood straighter and lifted her chin, made him step aside. If Elena Mendez wanted to face her demons, he wouldn't stop her. Castellanos entered the church like a man entering his own parlor, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor. He was smaller than Jake had expected, but there was something coiled about him, like a spring wound too tight. His eyes swept the interior of the church before settling on Elena with the intensity of a hunter studying his prey. "Señorita Mendez," he said in accented English, his voice cultured and pleasant. "Your uncle has been most worried about you, most worried indeed." "I'm sure he has," Elena replied, and Jake was surprised to hear a note of steel in her voice that matched Castellanos's false pleasantry. "Though I suspect his worry is more about my continued breathing than my welfare." Castellanos smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. Such harsh words about family. Don Carlos would be saddened to hear his daughter speak so. "Don Carlos is dead," Elena said flatly. "Murdered by Yaqui raiders that my uncle paid to kill him. I heard the planning, Señor Castellanos. I heard it all." The temperature in the church seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sheriff Hawkins shifted nervously, clearly out of his depth, while the 3 townsmen behind him exchanged worried glances. This was not the conversation they had expected. "That is a very serious accusation, Señorita," Castellanos said, his hand moving casually to rest on his gun butt. "And very dangerous. One might say foolishly dangerous." Jake had heard enough. He stepped forward, putting himself between Castellanos and Elena, his own hand ready to draw. "Seems to me this conversation is over, gentlemen. The lady has said her piece." Castellanos' attention shifted to Jake for the first time, sizing him up with the practiced eye of a professional killer. "And you are?" "Jake Sullivan. And I'm thinking you and your boys should mount up and ride out." "Ah, the famous Jake Sullivan." Castellanos' smile widened, becoming even more unpleasant. "Yes, I have heard of you. The man who single-handedly held off the Comanche war party at Little Creek. The man who outgunned 3 claim jumpers in Deadwood. The man whose wife and daughter died of influenza while he was drinking away his sorrows in a Denver saloon." The words hit Jake like physical blows. Elena gasped behind him, and he felt the familiar rage building in his chest. The same rage that had driven him into the bottle for 2 years after Martha and little Sarah had died. "Careful, Castellanos," Jake said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "You're about to say something that'll get you killed." "Am I?" Castellanos seemed genuinely amused. "Tell me, Sullivan, how many people have you failed to protect over the years? How many have died while you stood by helpless and drunk?" The church erupted into chaos. Jake's gun appeared in his hand with lightning speed, but Castellanos was just as fast, his own weapon clearing leather in a blur of motion. Elena screamed, throwing herself between them just as both men fired. The sound of gunshots in the enclosed space was deafening. Smoke filled the air, and for a moment, no one could see what had happened. When the smoke cleared, Elena was standing unharmed between Jake and Castellanos, both men's guns pointed at the ceiling. On the floor lay Sheriff Hawkins, a spreading pool of blood beneath his chest. "Enough!" Elena's voice cut through the shocked silence like a blade. "Enough killing, enough death. I am Elena Isabella Mendez de Castillo, daughter of Don Carlos Mendez, and I claim the right of blood justice for my father's murder." In the stunned silence that followed, Jake realized that everything had changed. The frightened young woman who had knelt in prayer was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a Spanish noblewoman claiming her birthright, with all the power and authority that implied. Castellanos lowered his gun slowly, his face showing the first signs of genuine concern. "Señorita, you do not understand the forces you are calling upon." "I understand perfectly," Elena replied, her voice carrying an authority that filled the church. "I understand that my uncle murdered my father, stole my inheritance, and sent killers after me. I understand that innocent people have died because of his greed, and I understand that it ends now." She turned to face Jake, her dark eyes blazing with purpose. "Will you stand with me, Jake Sullivan? Will you help me reclaim what is mine and bring justice to those who have died?" Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the helpless victim he had thought to protect, but a woman transformed by purpose and righteous anger. In that moment, he understood that his role in this story was not to save Elena Mendez, but to help her save herself. "Yes," he said simply, holstering his gun. "I'll stand with you." Outside, thunder rumbled again in the distance, promising another storm, but Jake no longer feared what was coming. For the first time in years, he was exactly where he needed to be. 3 days later, Jake stood on the ridge overlooking the Mendez hacienda, watching through his spyglass as armed men patrolled the grounds below. The sprawling adobe compound stretched across the valley floor like a small city, its red tile roofs gleaming in the afternoon sun. Somewhere in that maze of buildings and courtyards was Ramon Mendez, the man who had set this whole bloody chain of events in motion. Eleanor sat her horse beside him, no longer the frightened refugee who had sought sanctuary in Bitter Creek's church. She wore the clothes of a Spanish lady now, a black riding habit that had belonged to her mother, retrieved from a hidden cache in the desert, and carried herself with the poise of someone born to command. The transformation was so complete that Jake sometimes wondered if he had dreamed that vulnerable young woman. "How many men?" Elena asked, lowering her own spyglass. 40, maybe 50, Jake replied. "All armed, all professional. Your uncle isn't taking any chances." Behind them, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of their unlikely army. In the 3 days since the confrontation at the church, word had spread through the territory like wildfire. The rightful heir to the Mendez fortune had returned to claim what was hers. More importantly, she had proof of her uncle's treachery. The evidence had come from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley, the banker whose son had died in Bitter Creek, had finally broken down and confessed the truth. The 3 dead men had been poisoned, not by Elena's supposed witchcraft, but by Castellanos' agents, who had been trying to force the town to give up her location. The guilt of his false accusations had eaten at Bradley until he could no longer bear it. Now, as Jake watched the approaching riders, he marveled at what Elena had accomplished. Leading the group was Captain Rodriguez of the Mexican Army, a career officer who had served under Elena's father and still owed allegiance to the legitimate Mendez line. Behind him rode 24 soldiers, their uniforms dusty, but their weapons well maintained. But it wasn't just Mexican soldiers who had answered Elena's call. 3 Apache warriors rode with them, scouts who had been tracking Castellanos for months, seeking revenge for depredations against their people. A handful of American cowboys had joined as well, men who had worked for Don Carlos and remembered his fairness and generosity. Most surprising of all was the presence of Father Miguel, the old priest who had baptized Eleanor as a child. The elderly cleric had ridden hard from his mission parish, carrying with him documents that proved beyond doubt Elena's legitimacy and her uncle's crimes. "Señorita," Captain Rodriguez said as he reined in his horse beside them, "my men are ready. We await your orders." Elena studied the hacienda below for a long moment, her face impassive. Jake knew what she was thinking. This had been her home, the place where she had learned to ride and read and dream of the future. Now it was a fortress held by the man who had murdered her father. "Captain," she said finally, "I want my uncle taken alive. He must answer for his crimes before a proper court. But if his men resist—" She paused, her voice hardening. "Then they have chosen their fate." The attack began at sunset, with the Apache scouts moving silently through the shadows to eliminate the outer sentries. Jake found himself partnered with one of them, a warrior named Joseph, who spoke perfect English and had once been a student at Carlisle. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that he was fighting alongside men his own kind had tried to destroy. "You are not what I expected," Joseph said quietly as they belly-crawled toward the compound's eastern wall. "The stories of Jake Sullivan paint you as a man driven by demons." "Maybe I was," Jake replied, checking his weapons one last time. "But demons have a way of changing when you find something worth fighting for." The signal came as a mockingbird's call, a sound that would have seemed natural to anyone not expecting it. Jake and Joseph rose from the shadows simultaneously, their knives finding the throats of 2 guards before either could cry out. Around the perimeter of the compound, similar scenes played out as Eleanor's forces moved with deadly precision. The main assault came from the front gate, where Captain Rodriguez led his soldiers in a disciplined charge. The sound of gunfire erupted across the valley as Ramon's men realized they were under attack. Jake kicked open a window and rolled into what had once been Eleanor's childhood bedroom, his guns already drawn. The fighting was fierce but brief. Ramon's men were professionals, but they were also mercenaries, fighting for money rather than conviction. When it became clear that they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, many threw down their weapons and surrendered. Jake found Ramon Mendez in the hacienda's main office, desperately trying to burn papers that would incriminate him further. The man was older than his brother had been, with the soft look of someone who preferred others to do his fighting. When he saw Jake, he reached for a pistol on the desk, but Jake's Colt was already in his hand. "I wouldn't," Jake said calmly. "Your niece wants to see you." Ramon's face crumpled as Elena entered the room, flanked by Captain Rodriguez and Father Miguel. She looked around the office slowly, taking in the portraits of her ancestors on the walls, the massive desk where her father had conducted business for 30 years. "Tío," she said softly, using the Spanish word for uncle. "Why?" Ramon tried to straighten, to recover some dignity. "You are just a girl, Elena. What did you know of managing the estate, of dealing with the politics and violence of these times? I did what was necessary to preserve the family legacy." "By murdering your own brother?" Elena's voice was steady, but Jake could see the pain in her eyes. "By hiring killers to hunt down his only child?" "Carlos was weak," Ramon exploded, his composure finally cracking. "He gave land to the peones, paid fair wages to the vaqueros. He would have bankrupted us with his softness." "He was a good man," Elena said simply. "And now he is dead because you could not bear to see goodness in this world." Father Miguel stepped forward, producing the documents he had carried from his mission. "Before God and these witnesses, I attest that Elena Isabela Mendez de Castillo is the sole legitimate heir to the estate of Don Carlos Mendez. Ramon Mendez is hereby stripped of all authority and will be turned over to the territorial courts for trial." The formal words seemed to drain the last of Ramon's defiance. He slumped in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. Jake moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard, where Elena's forces were securing the compound. The Apache scouts were already mounted and preparing to leave. Their part in this was finished, and they had their own lives to return to. The soldiers were gathering the surrendered mercenaries, preparing them for transport to the territorial prison. "It's over," he said to Elena. She joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the faint scent of jasmine in her hair. "Is it? My father is still dead. The innocent people in Bitter Creek are still dead. How do we call that justice?" Jake thought about that for a moment, watching the sun set over the mountains that ringed the valley. "Maybe justice isn't about bringing back the dead," he said finally. "Maybe it's about making sure their deaths meant something." Eleanor nodded slowly. "The estate will be managed differently now. The vaqueros will own shares in the profits. The peonies will have land of their own to work. The schools my father planned will be built." "And you?" Jake asked. "What will you do now?" Elena turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. "That depends," she said softly, "on whether a certain drifter might be willing to settle down to help a woman rebuild what was lost." Jake looked out at the valley one more time, thinking of all the empty towns and meaningless days that had brought him to this moment. For the first time in years, the future stretched ahead of him, not as an endless succession of lonely roads, but as something bright with possibility. "Well," he said, taking Elena's hand in his, "I reckon I've been drifting long enough." Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The valley that had known so much violence and sorrow was finally at peace, and Jake Sullivan had found something he thought he'd lost forever, a home worth fighting for and a woman worth loving. The story would be told for generations, how a lone cowboy's simple act of courage had awakened an entire community to the power of justice, and how a young woman's fight for her birthright had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who had stood with her. In Bitter Creek, they would build a monument to the 3 men who had died, and every year on the anniversary of Elena's return, they would remember that sometimes the smallest act of courage can change the world. 5 years later, Jake Sullivan stood on the porch of the great house, watching his wife Elena teach their 3-year-old daughter, Sarah, how to ride. The little girl had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn determination, and she sat the small pony with the fearless confidence of someone born to the saddle. The Mendez Valley had prospered under Elena's leadership. The schools her father had dreamed of were now thriving centers of learning where Mexican and American children studied side by side. The vaqueros, who had once been hired hands, now owned shares in the cattle operations, and their families lived in comfortable houses instead of hovels. The Apache scouts who had helped reclaim the hacienda had been granted permanent grazing rights in the northern pastures, and trade between the three communities flourished. Tom Bradley had used his savings to establish a scholarship fund for the children of Bitter Creek, naming it after his son. Sheriff Hawkins had recovered from his wounds and become a different man, one who understood that true law came not from the barrel of a gun, but from the consent of the governed. Even Castellanos, serving 20 years in the territorial prison, had found religion and spent his days teaching literacy to his fellow inmates. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in Jake himself. The haunted drifter, who had ridden into Bitter Creek with nothing but a horse and a heart full of guilt, had become a man of substance and purpose. He served as the valley's unofficial peace officer. But more than that, he had become the kind of man who built things instead of just protecting them. "Papa," little Sarah called out in her mixture of English and Spanish. "Mira, look how fast I can go." Jake waved and called back encouragement, his heart swelling with a joy he had never thought possible. Eleanor caught his eye and smiled, the same radiant expression that had first made him understand what he was fighting for all those years ago. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Elena rested her head against Jake's shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up the freedom of the road for all this?" Jake thought about the question seriously, as he always did when Elena asked him something important. He thought about the countless empty miles he had traveled, the nameless towns where he had drunk himself into unconsciousness, the mornings when he had awakened not caring if he lived or died. "The road was never freedom," he said finally. "It was just another kind of prison. This..." He gestured at the valley spread out before them, at the lights beginning to twinkle in the houses of their workers and neighbors, at the sound of children's laughter drifting up from the courtyard. "This is what freedom really looks like." Eleanor squeezed his hand, and they sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance a guitar was playing, and voices joined in harmony on an old Mexican ballad about love and loss and the courage to begin again. The story of Jake Sullivan and Elena Mendez would become legend in the territory, told around campfires by cowboys, whispered in cantinas by travelers, taught to children as an example of how one person's courage could ripple outward to change an entire world. But for the two people sitting on that porch, watching their daughter chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, it was simply the story of how they had found each other, and in finding each other, had found themselves. In the end, that was the real miracle. Not that a drifter had saved a lady, or that a lady had reclaimed her birthright, but that two broken people had discovered that healing was possible when you had someone worth healing for. The valley had given them a home, but they had given each other something infinitely more precious, a reason to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday, and that love, however late it came, was always worth the wait. As the moon rose over the Mendez Valley, casting silver shadows across the land that had seen so much sorrow and joy, Jake Sullivan finally understood what his mother had tried to teach him all those years ago in that cramped cabin back east, that a man's true worth wasn't measured by how far he could ride or how fast he could draw, but by how well he loved the people who trusted him to stay, and Jake Sullivan was finally ready to stay.